I am 79 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am going to tell the truth about what I did. The whole truth, not the version I have told myself for 55 years to be able to fall asleep at night. My name is Edward Callahan. Most people who know me now call me Eddie, or Mr. Callahan, or the quiet man who fixes clocks. I run a small repair shop in a town in Ohio most people drive through without stopping. Nobody in this town knows the thing I am about to tell you. My neighbors think I'm a widower who never had children. That's not true. I have a son. He is 54 years old, and until 3 months ago, he had not spoken to me in over 3 decades. I am not recording this confession because I want your sympathy. I don't deserve it, and honestly, I'm not sure I want it. I'm recording it because a doctor sat across from me 2 months ago and told me, in the careful, gentle way doctors use when the news isn't good, that I likely have somewhere between 6 months and 2 years left. And in those 2 months since, I have done more thinking about who I actually was at 24 years old than I have allowed myself to do in the previous 5 decades combined. So here it is, the confession. The thing that cost me a son, a marriage, and, if I'm being honest with myself, most of my capacity to be truly happy for the rest of my life. At 24 years old, I got a girl pregnant. Her name was Margaret Doyle, and I loved her. Genuinely, deeply, in the uncomplicated way you love someone at that age, before life has taught you how expensive love actually is. And when she told me, standing in her mother's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October, that she was going to have my child, I did not do what a man is supposed to do. I panicked. And 3 weeks later, I packed one suitcase, told my own mother I had accepted a factory foreman position 2 states away, and I left town before Margaret's belly had even begun to show. I told myself, that whole drive, that I would send for her once I was settled. I told myself 100 different versions of that lie over the following months. I believed, or at least I convinced myself I believed, every single one of them. I did not send for her. Not that year. Not the next one either. And by the time I finally worked up the courage to write her a real letter, not a check with a few careless lines attached, but an actual letter explaining myself, it came back 3 weeks later, unopened, stamped with 2 words that I still see clearly behind my eyes every single night before I fall asleep. Return to sender. To understand how a 24-year-old man does something like that, you have to understand who I was before I did it, because I promise you, I did not wake up one morning and decide to become the kind of man who abandons a pregnant woman. Men like that, I've come to believe over the decades, are built slowly, one small cowardice at a time, until the big cowardice simply feels like the next logical step. I grew up the youngest of 4 brothers in a house where money was tight and pride was the only thing my father had plenty of. He worked the steel mill for 31 years and never once, not a single day in his life, asked anyone for help with anything, even when help would have kept our family from going hungry some winters. He used to say a man who needs rescuing isn't a man at all. I absorbed that lesson so deeply I didn't even recognize it as a lesson. I thought it was simply true. Margaret and I met at a county dance the summer I turned 22. She had a laugh that made strangers turn their heads, and a way of looking directly at you when she spoke, like whatever you were saying actually mattered to her. We fell in love the uncomplicated way young people do. Quickly, completely, without any real sense yet of what love would eventually cost either of us. We talked about marriage. We talked about a small house on the edge of town, close enough to her mother that she could help with the wash, far enough that we'd have our own porch to sit on in the evenings. I meant every word of those conversations. I want you to understand that. I was not lying to her during those 2 years. I was simply a man who had never once been tested by real responsibility, and I did not yet know what I would do the moment I actually was. The test came on a Sunday afternoon in her mother's kitchen, the smell of pot roast still in the air, when Margaret took my hand across the table and told me, quietly, that she'd missed her second month in a row. I remember my exact first thought because it has haunted me for 55 years. My first thought was not about Margaret. It was not about the child. My first thought was, my father will never let me hear the end of this. A 24-year-old man about to become a father himself, and the thing that terrified him most was his own father's disapproval. I told Margaret that afternoon everything a frightened man tells a woman he loves in that moment, that we'd figure it out together, that I wasn't going anywhere, that I loved her and I loved this child already, even though I couldn't yet picture its face. 3 weeks later, I was 2 states away, and I had told no one, not even my own mother, the real reason I had left. I built an entire life over the following 2 years on a foundation of not thinking about what I had done. It is a strange, quiet kind of skill, learning how to not think about something. I got quite good at it. I threw myself into the foreman job. I worked doubles whenever they were offered. I drank more than I should have on the nights. The work wasn't enough to tire my mind out completely. I sent Margaret money for the first several months. Modest amounts, mailed without a return address. The coward's version of responsibility, giving just enough to quiet my own conscience without ever giving what actually mattered, which was myself, present in that child's life. I told myself the money was the important part. I have never believed a bigger lie in my entire life. My son was born in the spring. I know this only because my mother, who had by then learned the truth from Margaret's family and never fully forgave me for it, wrote to tell me. She named him James, my mother's letter said. Margaret named him James after her own father, and Margaret's mother is helping raise him because Margaret has had to take a job at the textile mill to support them both. I did not go back. I want to be honest with you about why, because the honest reason is far uglier than any excuse I gave myself at the time. It wasn't that I couldn't afford the trip or that my job wouldn't allow the time off, though I told myself both of those things for years. The honest reason is that I had become terrified, genuinely, paralyzingly terrified, of standing in front of Margaret and my son and having to see, in both of their faces, exactly what kind of man I actually was. It is far easier to live with a version of yourself you've never had to look directly at. By the time I finally gathered the courage to write that real letter, the one explaining myself, the one asking if there was any way back, nearly 3 years had passed. James was walking, talking, probably, calling some other man uncle at Sunday dinners, a man who was actually showing up. The letter came back unopened. Return to sender. I found out much later from my mother that Margaret had remarried by then. A decent, steady man named Thomas Whitcomb, who worked at the mill alongside her and who, my mother told me carefully, treated James like his own son from the very first year. I remember sitting in my small rented room that evening with that returned letter in my hands and understanding, for the first time with total clarity, that I had not simply made a mistake. I had built, brick by brick, a wall between myself and my own son that another, better man was now living behind in my place. I told myself that James was better off. It was the last lie I let myself believe for a very long time, because it let me stop trying. I married a woman named Susan 4 years later. She was kind, patient, and completely unaware for the first 11 years of our marriage that I had a son living 3 states away who did not know I existed as anything other than an absence. We had 2 daughters together, Patricia and Louise, and I want to tell you something that took me decades to admit even to myself. I loved them deeply, but I never let myself love them completely. There was always a locked room somewhere inside me, a place I would not let anyone, not Susan, not my daughters, not even myself in quiet moments, fully enter. I told myself this was simply my nature, that I was a private man, a reserved man. The truth was far simpler and far more damning. I was a man guarding a secret so carefully that I had, without realizing it, built walls around my entire heart, not just the part connected to James. Patricia once asked me, when she was maybe 9 years old, why I never talked about my own childhood, why there were no old photographs of me as a boy anywhere in our house. I gave her some vague answer about not being sentimental. The real answer was that every photograph from that period of my life had Margaret standing somewhere near the edge of the frame, and I could not bear to look at them. Susan found out the truth about James when Patricia was 12 through an old family friend who mentioned him at a funeral, assuming Susan already knew. I remember coming home from work that evening to find Susan sitting at our kitchen table, very still, the same way Margaret's mother had once sat, all those years earlier, when the world she believed in had quietly rearranged itself into something she didn't recognize. Susan did not leave me. I think, looking back, I sometimes wish she had, because staying required her to slowly, carefully rebuild trust in a man who had proven, in the most fundamental way possible, that he was capable of walking away from his own child without a backward glance. She asked me, that night, one question I have never forgotten. Eddie, she said quietly, if you could walk away from him, how do I know you couldn't walk away from us? I did not have a good answer for her then. I'm not certain I have a complete one even now, 50 years later. What I do know is that Susan stayed, and slowly, imperfectly, we built a real marriage on top of that broken foundation, one that lasted 38 years until cancer took her 4 years ago. But something had shifted permanently between us that night at the kitchen table, some door that had been opened before and simply never fully reopened again. I did not reach out to James. Not when Susan found out. Not when Patricia and Louise grew old enough to understand they had a half-brother somewhere they had never met. I told myself, every single year, that it was too late now, that reaching out after so long would only hurt him further, that leaving him alone was somehow the kinder choice. I told myself that lie for 51 years. And then, 3 months ago, my telephone rang, and a voice I had never heard before, but somehow immediately recognized in the shape of it, said 4 words that broke something open in me that I had spent half a century keeping carefully sealed shut. Is this Edward Callahan? His name is James Whitcomb. He took his stepfather's last name legally when he was 18 years old, a fact that told me, before he had said almost anything else, exactly how he had come to feel about the man who had actually raised him versus the one who hadn't. He had found me through an old Army records request, tracing a father he barely remembered anything about, driven, he told me later, not by forgiveness but by his own mother's recent passing. Margaret had died 8 months earlier, and going through her belongings, James had found the returned letter I sent all those decades ago, still sealed, still unopened, kept in a small box with a handful of other things she had apparently never been able to bring herself to throw away. He asked if he could come see me. I said yes before I had even fully processed what saying yes would mean. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a 54-year-old man with Margaret's exact laugh lines around eyes that were unmistakably, unbearably my own. We sat across from each other in my small living room, two strangers who happened to share blood, and for the first several minutes, neither of us said very much at all. Then James reached into his jacket and set the unopened letter on the coffee table between us. The same one, still sealed after 51 years, my handwriting on the envelope faded but legible. I never got to hear whatever you said in this, he told me, his voice steady but tight. I spent my whole childhood being told, gently, by people trying to protect me, that my father simply wasn't in the picture. Nobody ever told me you tried, one time, 51 years ago, and then apparently just stopped. I did not defend myself. I had promised myself, driving over every excuse in my head the night before his visit, that I would not defend myself, because every excuse I had ever constructed had already cost me too much to keep hiding behind them now. I told him the truth, all of it, the fear at 24, the cowardice disguised as a job opportunity, the years of silence disguised as protecting him. I told him about Susan, about Patricia and Louise, about the locked room inside myself I had never let anyone fully enter, including, I admitted to him for the first time out loud, myself. James listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands folded carefully in his lap, the way I imagine a man learns to hold himself when he has spent an entire life being disappointed by the same absence. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the sentence that has replayed in my mind every single day since. I had a son of my own, you know. He's 26 now. And the day he was born, I made myself a promise, standing in that hospital room, that whatever else happened in my life, I would never once let him wonder, even for a single day, whether his father wanted him. He stood up to leave shortly after that. He did not say whether he would come back. The 3 weeks after James left were the loneliest of my entire life, and I want you to understand something about that loneliness, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who might be sitting with a similar silence in their own life. It was not simply the loneliness of being alone in a house. I had lived alone plenty of years since Susan passed and managed it well enough. This was a different kind of loneliness entirely. The loneliness of finally, after 51 years, seeing the full shape of what I had done, with nowhere left to hide from it. I found myself, during those 3 weeks, going through old boxes I had not opened in decades. I found a single photograph, tucked into the back pages of an old Bible my mother had given me, of Margaret at 21, laughing at something just outside the frame, a photograph I had apparently kept all these years, without ever once letting myself look directly at it. I thought, more than once during those weeks, about simply letting it go, about accepting that I had caused a wound too deep and too old to heal, and that perhaps the kindest thing left for me to do was to leave James alone entirely, the way I had convinced myself, for 51 years, was somehow the generous choice. But I recognized, finally, the shape of that thought for exactly what it was. It was the same cowardice, wearing a new disguise. It had always been easier for me to disappear than to stay and do the harder, more frightening work of actually being present for the damage I had caused. So instead, I wrote him a letter. A real one this time. Not the version I sent 51 years ago, careful and half-hearted and easily abandoned the moment it came back sealed. This one I wrote knowing, fully, that it might come back unopened again, and that if it did, I would have to find the courage to accept that as the final answer I deserved. I told him everything I hadn't managed to say clearly enough during his visit. I told him about the 26-year-old grandson I had never met, and that I understood completely if that never changed. I told him that I was not asking him to forgive me, because I did not believe that was mine to ask for. I was only asking for the chance, however small, to know him now, in whatever way he was willing to allow, for however much time I had left. I mailed it on a Thursday morning and spent the following 11 days checking my mailbox with a kind of nervous, aching hope I had not allowed myself to feel about anything in decades. On the 12th day, my phone rang. It was James. "My son's name is Michael," he said, without any greeting at all, his voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been during his visit. "He's been asking about you since I told him. He wants to know if you'd like to meet him before." His voice caught, and he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We both knew exactly what he meant by before. I met my grandson Michael on a Saturday morning in June, in a small diner James chose, I suspect deliberately, because it offered an easy, low-pressure way for any of us to leave early if the conversation became too much to bear. It didn't. Michael, it turned out, had inherited his grandmother Margaret's exact laugh, the same one that had made strangers turn their heads at that county dance 60 years earlier, before any of the damage I'm confessing to you had happened yet. He asked me careful, gentle questions about my life, not accusatory, simply curious. The questions of a 26-year-old trying to understand a grandfather who had, for his entire life, existed only as an absence and a story. James was quieter that day, watching the two of us with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not quite forgiveness, but not quite the guarded distance of our first meeting either. Something in between. Something, I've come to believe, that doesn't have a single clean word in the English language, because most real healing doesn't arrive in a single clean moment. It arrives slowly, in small, uncertain pieces, the way trust always does when it's being rebuilt on ground that's already cracked. We have had 4 more visits since that Saturday. I will not pretend to you that they have been easy, or that James and I have found some tidy, movie-perfect reconciliation. There are entire decades of his childhood I will never be part of. Birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesday evenings I was not there for, and no number of visits now can retroactively place me in any of them. James has told me, plainly, more than once, that there are things he is still working through. Some anger that hasn't fully resolved and may never fully resolve. And I have told him, just as plainly, that he owes me nothing. Not his forgiveness, not his patience, not even his continued visits, if at some point they become too painful for him to keep making. But he keeps coming. And Michael has started calling me, once a week, just to talk. The kind of easy, unhurried conversations I never once had with James at that age, because I wasn't there to have them. 2 weeks ago, Michael asked me a question that undid something in me I didn't know was still capable of breaking. "Grandpa," he said, "the first time anyone has ever called me that? Are you scared?" About the diagnosis, I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't scared of dying nearly as much as I was scared for 51 years of really living, of staying present for the people who needed me to stay. I told him that fear had cost me more than dying ever could. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I don't think I will ever be able to fully repay him for. "Well," he said, "you're staying now. That counts for something. Maybe it counts for a lot. I don't know exactly how much time I have left. The doctors gave me a range, and I have stopped asking them to narrow it, because I have come to understand, these past few months, that the exact number matters far less than what I choose to do with whatever time remains. I see James most weeks now. Not every week. There are still weeks when the old wound between us needs space, and I have finally learned, at 79 years old, the difference between giving someone space and disappearing on them, a distinction I did not understand at 24 and spent 51 years failing to learn. Michael calls faithfully, every Sunday evening, and 2 weeks ago he brought his girlfriend to meet me, a kind, quick-witted young woman named Sarah, and for one entire evening, sitting at my small kitchen table with the three of them, I felt something I have almost no memory of feeling before. I felt, briefly, like I belonged fully inside a family, instead of standing carefully at its edge, guarding some locked room inside myself. I want to say something directly to whoever is listening to this confession, because I did not record it simply to unburden myself. I recorded it because I believe, with everything I have left, that somewhere out there is a version of the 24-year-old man I once was. Someone standing at the edge of a decision that feels, right now, impossibly frightening. Someone who is one panicked choice away from building the same kind of wall I built, brick by brick, over 51 years. If that is you, I am asking you, as plainly and as honestly as I know how, not to do what I did. Not because the fear you're feeling isn't real. It is real, I promise you. I have never doubted for a single day that my fear at 24 was genuine. But fear is not a reliable narrator of what you are actually capable of surviving. I survived losing everything I was afraid of losing, and it cost me 51 years I will never get back. 51 years my son spent without a father. 51 years I spent pretending that absence was somehow easier than presence. It was never easier. It only felt easier, in the moment, because staying required courage I did not yet have. I found that courage eventually. Far too late to undo the damage, but not, it turns out, too late to matter at all. James and I will never have the 51 years we lost, but we have whatever time is left, and I intend to spend every remaining day of it showing up, fully, for the people I once walked away from. Not because it erases what I did, but because showing up late is still infinitely better than never showing up at all. My name is Edward Callahan. I spent most of my life running from a mistake I made at 24 years old. And in the small amount of time I have left, I am finally staying. If this confession meant something to you, if there is someone in your own life you have been meaning to call, a door you have been meaning to walk back through, please don't wait as long as I did. Some walls can still come down, even after 51 years. But some cannot be rebuilt at all if you wait too long to start. Thank you for staying with me through this. It means more than you know.